This is part 2 of chapter 2. Saul chose 3,000 of the best warriors and sent the rest of the army home. Jonathan wondered why. Aren't we going to attack the Philistine outpost? I have no quarrel with the Philistines. No quarrel? But father, they've oppressed us for years. We have 2 swords between us and no blacksmiths. That's reason enough not to start a war with them. Had his father so quickly forgotten the lessons of Jabesh Gilead? God is our strength. Winning one battle against the Ammonites does not mean we can win a war against the Philistines. But the Lord gave us victory over Nahash. We need not return home, tail stuck between our knees. Abner grasped Jonathan's shoulder, fingers biting in warning. We will discuss all this as we travel south. The army camped at Michmash. The king had no plans to attack the Philistine outpost at Geba, even though it was close enough to threaten Geba. Jonathan listened at the military council's meetings, but heard nothing that would solve the threat to his father's reign if the warriors at Geba moved against Gibeah. So he spoke again. It is not wise to have enemies so close to our home. Saul is king of Israel, and Gibeah is now the center of the nation. What's to stop the Philistines from attacking my father? Saul looked at Abner and then the others for an answer. When they gave none, he shrugged. I will remain here in Michmash until we see how the Philistines take the news of Nahash's defeat. What had happened to his father's boldness? Where was the fierce King Saul who had hacked 2 oxen to pieces and led Israel into battle? What of mother? What of your sons and daughters? Gibeah! Saul scowled. You can go there and secure the city, close the gates and guard the city. Jonathan blushed. I can't hide behind the city walls while you're here. My place is beside you against the enemies of God. You will go to Gibeah. I have Abner and 3,000 of Israel's best to guard me. I'll stay here in Michmash as we plan for the days ahead. You go home. Didn't he understand? The Ammonites are in fear of us, and the Philistines will be as well. Kish snorted. Young blood flows hot with foolishness. Saul glared at his father and then looked at Jonathan again. Samuel is no longer with us. God is with us, Jonathan said. God was with me at Jabesh Gilead, but I do not feel his presence with me now. Father, Saul's eyes darkened. The Philistines are not the cowards the Ammonites are. Jonathan moved closer and lowered his voice so the others wouldn't hear. If the Ammonites were cowards, Father, why did we fear them for so long? Saul's head came up, eyes flashing, but Jonathan knew the fear that lurked behind the king's quick temper. Kish smiled and patted Jonathan on the back. There is a time for everything, Jonathan. Lord, make them see. Yes, but the time is now. Nahash is dead. The Ammonites are scattered. The Philistines will have heard how King Saul mustered the army and slaughtered the invaders. They were in fear of us before my king, and they will be again. God is on our side. We have the advantage. Abner put his hand on Jonathan's shoulder. Jonathan shook it off. Saul's eyes glowed. No one doubts your courage, my son. Kish's eyes flickered, but courage must be tempered with wisdom. Jonathan looked at his grandfather. I thought you wanted war. He looked around at the others. Do not dismiss what I say. There is a difference between the Ammonites who attempted to take the land, Saul waved his hand over the maps, and the Philistines who have occupied it for years. They have strongholds. It is our land, Father, the land God gave us. It's time we drove them back into the sea from which they came. Saul raised his hands. Using what against them? They have iron weapons. We have 2 swords. Our warriors carry dull mattocks, ruined axes, chipped sickles, and spears. Even if we had a blacksmith, do I have the shekels to pay to sharpen weapons for an army? And if I did, the Philistines would know we were preparing for war and they'd come down and drown us in our own blood. So we wait. We do nothing when they raid our crops. What crops? Kish ground out. God destroyed the wheat. We wait, my son. We plan. Fear still reigned in Israel. Jonathan's father put his arm around him and walked him to the entrance of the tent. You go to Gibeah with the men I've assigned to secure the city. Jonathan bowed his head and left the tent. He would go to Gibeah and do exactly what his father commanded, and then he would destroy Geba before the Philistines there had time to attack and destroy his father. Raging, Saul paced before Jonathan, who was still exultant over the defeat of Geba. What sort of message does it give all Israel when my own son doesn't listen to me? I secured Gibeah and destroyed Geba. You've brought disaster on us all. Did you think killing a few hundred Philistines and burning a small outpost would accomplish anything? You pulled the tail off the lion, and now you will turn and devour us. When the word spreads of what you did, we will have all Philistia thirsting for our blood. We are not ready for this war. Jonathan shrank inwardly as doubt squelched his assurance that God wanted him to attack the outpost. Was I listening to my own pride? If they obeyed God, would the Lord not give them the victory on every side? Would the Lord not help them rid their land of the Philistines, just as he had helped us crush the Ammonites at Jabesh Gilead? Samuel said, "Be silent. I am the king. Let me think." Saul gripped his head. "I didn't expect rebellion from you." Abner cleared his throat. "My lord, what order shall I give the men?" Saul lowered his hands and stared off into space. "My lord?" Saul turned, jaw set. "Send out messengers and have them blow the trumpets. Tell everyone I attacked the Philistine outpost." He glared at Jonathan. "Better if the people think I acted boldly than have them know my son acted in haste and without the backing of the king." Humiliated, his confidence shredded by doubt, Jonathan said nothing. Jonathan went cold when he heard 3,000 Philistine chariots had been sighted. Each bore a driver and a skilled warrior equipped with bow and arrows and several spears. Saul paled. "How many soldiers?" "Too many to count, my lord. They are numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore, and they're already at Bethaven." Worse news came the following morning. Some of Saul's warriors had deserted in the night. Terrified by the power of Philistia, others clustered and whispered among themselves. The men of Israel took to caves and thickets, hid among the rocks and in pits and dry cisterns. Saul returned to Gilgal and waited for Samuel. Jonathan went with him, as did a young armor bearer Saul pressed into Jonathan's service. What Ebenezer lacked in size, he made up for in zeal. Kish, Abner, and the others were full of advice for the king, but the king listened to no one. Racked with guilt, Jonathan spent hours in unceasing prayer, asking for God's forgiveness and pleading for guidance. Though many cheered the victory of Geba, most were sick with fear and ready to run. Abner grew frustrated and confronted the king. "We have less than 2,000 warriors right now, my lord, and more are deserting every day. You must make a decision." Jonathan was afraid to give advice. He was afraid to make claims about what God would do. No one could question God's power, but every man alive in Israel questioned whether he would use it in their defense. Worse, Jonathan realized now that his one small victory could precipitate an all-out war. He looked out over the tents and couldn't help wonder how so few could stand against so many. Rather than rallying his father and his army, Jonathan had succeeded only in bringing their fear to the surface and sending thousands into hiding. "What a sight we are. Lord, why is it so hard for your people to trust you when you've proven your power and your faithfulness to us time after time? Is it because we know we continue to sin? How do we root out the sin in us? Our fathers didn't listen to you, and now we don't. Only a few days ago, you sent lightning and thunder and rain, and all these men can think about since is their ruined crops and what they'll eat when winter comes. You are God. You hold our lives in the palms of your hands." Fear spread like tares in the wheat until even Jonathan felt the roots of it sinking into his heart. Some of those who had been with him at Gibeah deserted. Each morning revealed more empty spaces among the camps of Saul's best of Israel. The king grew more and more frustrated. "The entire army will scatter before that old man gets here." Jonathan shuddered. That old man? Samuel was God's prophet, God's voice to the people. He will come. Where is he? Why does he delay? He said he would come in 7 days. It hasn't been 7 days yet, Father. Soon my entire army will have melted away. Abner did what he could to rally the remaining warriors, but confidence in the king was at its lowest ebb, and the prophet's warning was fresh in their minds. Their king had brought trouble upon them. Forgotten was the victory over the Ammonites. All men could think of was the gathering storm of war. 3,000 chariots and multitude of foot soldiers getting ready to destroy them. Jonathan felt he had to do something to make up for bringing all this on his father, but what? What, Lord? No answer came. Jonathan awakened Ebenezer before dawn on the 7th day. If my father misses me, tell him I've gone out to wait for Samuel. Jonathan went to the edge of the shrinking camp. Men huddled over their fires, ducking their heads when he glanced their way. He didn't want to think about what they might be discussing. Because of me, Lord, they've lost hope in your king. The sun rose and there was no sign of Samuel. Jonathan worried. Had his actions at Geba caused the prophet trouble as well? What if the Philistines had taken him captive? Or worse, what if they'd killed the aged man of God? He broke out in a cold sweat, even thinking such thoughts. Lord, we need him. He speaks your word to us. Please protect him and please bring him to us. Oh God, help us. Tell us what you want us to do. I thought I was stepping out in faith, but maybe my father and his advisors are right and I acted the fool. If so, forgive me, Lord. Let the trouble fall on my head and not on my father's, not on those men who shake with fear. Don't abandon us on my account, Lord. Jonathan's armor bearer, Ebenezer, came running. The king, he rasped for breath. The king wants you with him. He's going to make the sacrifice. What? Jonathan ran as fast as he could, Ebenezer close behind him. When he reached his father's tent, he entered and went cold at the sight of what the king was wearing. A priestly ephod? No! His lungs burned. His heart pounded so hard he thought he would choke. He grasped the law he wore around his neck. You can't do this, father. The law says only the priest. There is no priest. Terrified for all their sakes, Jonathan went to his father. It's not midday yet, my lord. Samuel will come. Sweat beaded on Saul's brow. I called for him and he did not come. I can't wait any longer. His face was pale and strained. The Lord will not help us if you do this. My army, my men are leaving me. What would you have me do? He looked around at all of his advisors. Whatever is in your heart to do, my king, they all seem to agree. Jonathan looked from Abner to Kish and the others and went back to his father. Samuel will come. He stepped in front of his father. Gideon had fewer men than we have, and he defeated the Midianites. I am not Gideon. You were a farmer like him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon you too. You gathered a force of 330,000 warriors and defeated the Ammonites. And where are my warriors now? Saul yanked the flap of the tent aside. Gone. You have more than Gideon had. Nahash and the Ammonites are destroyed. The Philistines are a worse scourge than the Midianites or the Ammonites. Saul let the flap fall. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. I never asked to be king. I never asked for any of this. God chose you, father. Jonathan spoke as calmly as he could, though their fear seeped into him. Trust in the Lord and the power of his strength. And what does that mean? Abner stepped forward. In practical, tactical terms, Jonathan. God could send lightning bolts on our enemies, Kish agreed. Why doesn't he? Saul turned abruptly. Where is the ark? They all looked at him. Maybe if I had the ark with me. The Philistines were afraid of it once, remember? Jonathan felt a knot growing in his stomach. Did his father mean to use the ark like an idol? They captured the ark. Yes, and a plague of mice and rats destroyed their crops, and the Philistines were sick with tumors, and eventually they sent it back on a cart loaded down with gold. Saul told Abner. How long would it take to bring it here? A warrior entered the tent. There's still no sign of Samuel, my lord. Abner frowned. There is no time. You must do something now, before all the men are gone. Everyone agreed. Don't! Jonathan was the lone voice in the tent. He looked into his father's face. Wait, please. Give the seer more time. Abner shook his head. You know too little of men, Jonathan. If we wait much longer, the camp will be empty and the king will stand alone. How long do you think your father will survive with just those of us inside this tent to defend him? Abner's words swayed Saul. Bring me the burnt offerings and the peace offerings. We can't ask God to help us unless we give him something. Jonathan's heart pounded heavily, the pit of his stomach like a hard, cold ball of fear. He drew out the law. You mustn't do this, father. Please listen, I can show you. Do you not yet understand? Saul shouted. I can't wait. His eyes blazed. I won't wait. Samuel promised he would come. He didn't keep his word. Saul went outside. Gather some stones. We'll build the altar right here. He grabbed Jonathan's arm. You will stand over there and say no more. His chin jerked up. The king of other nations makes sacrifices before their armies. Why shouldn't I? Saul turned to Abner. Call the men. They must see what I do. Tell them I am making an offering to the Lord, so he will help us. Jonathan turned to Ebenezer and spoke quietly. Station yourself where you can see anyone approaching the camp. When you see Saul, run back here like the wind and shout, he is coming. Hurry. Yes, my lord. The boy drew back from the others, turned, and ran to do Jonathan's bidding. As the young prince watched his father, he wondered if God would take Saul's fear into account. Lord, forgive him. He doesn't know what he's doing. The men gathering looked pleased by what was about to happen. Had his father read, written, and studied the law, he would know better than to defy the Lord like this. But those who followed him would know better than to trust their lives to the plans of men. The sun hovered above the western horizon. A crippled calf was brought to Saul. Why kill a healthy one without blemish, as the law commanded? It seemed that as long as his father had decided to disregard one part of the law, none of its other instructions mattered either. Jonathan watched as the king, Saul, put his hand on the animal's head, prayed loudly for God's help, and then slit the calf's throat. Jonathan closed his eyes, sickened by the ceremony. Soon he smelled smoke mingled with the stench of disobedience. Dismissed, the men went about their duties. Saul looked at Jonathan and smiled, confident again. He went back inside his tent to talk to his advisors. Jonathan sat, head in his hands. Ebenezer came running. Face flushed, out of breath, he rasped, "The prophet comes!" Shame filled Jonathan. How could he face Samuel? Saul came outside. "Come, we will meet him together." He spread his arms wide and smiled warmly. "Welcome, Samuel." Samuel's eyes blazed. His fingers whitened on his staff. "Saul, what is this you have done?" Surprised, Saul frowned. He looked from the prophet to the men around him. "I saw my men scattering from me," his eyes narrowed coldly, "and that you didn't arrive when you said you would, and the Philistines are at Michmash ready for battle. So I said, the Philistines are ready to march against us at Gilgal, and I haven't even asked the Lord's help. So I felt compelled," he swept his hand, taking in his advisors, "to offer the burnt offering myself before you came." Jonathan looked between the two men. Wasn't his father's sin bad enough without trying to cast blame on the seer? Samuel's glance took in everyone. "Leave us." Jonathan wanted to flee before the wrath that was to come. "My son stays," Saul commanded Jonathan with a gesture. Jonathan took his place beside his father. He could not desert him now. How could he when Geba had started all this? Samuel stared at Saul. "How foolish! You have not kept the command your Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command." Jonathan cringed. Saul gritted his teeth in anger, but when the prophet turned away, the king took a step toward him. "You turn your back on me, Samuel? You turn your back on Israel's king? Where are you going?" "I'm going to Gibeah." Samuel sounded weary and disheartened. "I would advise you to do the same." Saul kicked the dust. "Go and tell Abner to count the men we have left." Tears pricked Jonathan's eyes as he watched the old prophet walk away. "We should follow Samuel, Father, after we find out how many men we have left." Jonathan wanted to cry out in grief. What did it matter how many men stood with a king rejected by God? "Let me speak to him on your behalf." "Go if you think you can do any good." Saul turned away. Jonathan ran after Samuel. Samuel turned when he came near and spoke to those accompanying him. They moved away. Samuel leaned heavily on his staff, his face etched with exhaustion and sorrow. Jonathan fell to his knees and bowed his face to the ground. "Stand up." Jonathan surged to his feet, trembling. "Why do you chase after me? Do you mean to use your sword against me?" "No," Jonathan blanched. my father means you no harm, nor do I. Please, I came to ask if you to forgive me. The blame is mine. Samuel shook his head. You did not perform the sacrifice. Tears blurred Jonathan's eyes. My father was afraid because of what I did at Geba, all this. He could not see Samuel's expression or guess what the seer thought. I'm the one who attacked Geba and brought the Philistines' wrath upon us. When we heard of the forces that were coming against us, the men began to desert. My father, each man makes his own decisions, Jonathan, and each bears the consequences of what he decides. But are we not also prey to circumstances around us? You know better. Can there be no allowances for mistakes, for fear? Who is the enemy, Jonathan? The Philistines, Jonathan wept. I don't want God to be our enemy. What can I do to make things right? Samuel put his hand on Jonathan's shoulder. What do you wear against your heart, my son? Jonathan put his hand against his breastplate. The law. Did you write it in your own hand because you thought you would be king someday? Jonathan blinked. Had he? Samuel said that Saul's kingdom would not last now. Did that mean Israel would fall? Did that mean the people would all suffer at the hands of their enemies? You say nothing. Jonathan searched his eyes. I want to say no, he swallowed hard. But do I know myself well enough to answer? Speak the truth to the king, no matter what others around him say, and pray for him, my son. Samuel released him. Jonathan longed for reassurance. Will you pray for my father? Surely the prayers of a righteous man would be heard by God. Yes. Jonathan grasped hope. Then the Lord our God will not abandon us completely. God does not abandon men, my son. Men abandon God. As the old prophet headed toward Gibeah, his companions joined him. Jonathan stood watching for a long time, praying for Samuel's safety and for his father, the king, to repent. And that's the end of part 2.